A simple cup of coffee has fueled revolutions, built empires, inspired great ideas, and generated hundreds of billions of dollars every year. It has crossed continents, survived religious bans, and transformed entire economies. Yet none of it would have happened without a small herd of restless goats wandering through the misty highlands of Ethiopia more than 1,000 years ago. Whether that famous story is entirely true remains a mystery, but it marks the beginning of one of the greatest journeys in human history. Around the 9th century, in the rugged mountains of southwestern Ethiopia, a young goat herder named Kaldi followed his flock across dense forests and rocky hillsides, just as he had done every day before. The land was covered with ancient trees, cool mountain air drifted through the valleys, and wild shrubs grew beneath the forest canopy. It was an ordinary afternoon until his goats began behaving in a way he had never witnessed before. Instead of slowing down after hours of grazing, the animals became strangely energetic. They leaped from rock to rock, chased one another across the hills, and refused to rest as sunset approached. At first, Kaldi thought a predator had frightened them. He searched the surrounding forest but found nothing. Then he wondered if the animals had eaten something poisonous, yet they looked perfectly healthy. Curious, he continued watching and noticed that every excited goat returned to the same evergreen shrub covered with clusters of bright red cherries. Driven by curiosity, Kaldi picked one of the fruits and examined it carefully. The berries looked ordinary, their sweet flesh hiding 2 pale green seeds inside. According to the legend, he tasted the fruit himself and soon felt unusually alert, as though the exhaustion of the day had simply disappeared. Excited by the discovery, he carried the mysterious cherries to a nearby monastery, hoping the monks could explain what he had found. The monks were skeptical. Some believed the strange fruit might be a temptation rather than a blessing and, according to the legend, threw the berries into a fire. Moments later, something unexpected happened. As the beans roasted, an extraordinary aroma filled the room, unlike anything they had ever smelled before. Unable to ignore the fragrance, the monks rescued the beans from the flames, crushed them into small pieces, mixed them with hot water, and unknowingly created what countless generations would later recognize as the world's first cup of coffee. It is a captivating story, repeated in books, documentaries, and coffee shops around the world. There is only one problem. Historians have never found any evidence that Kaldi actually existed. No records from the 9th century mention his name. No monastery documented such an event, and the legend itself did not appear in written history until several centuries later. To modern historians, Kaldi is less a historical figure than a symbol, a story created to explain how humanity first encountered one of nature's most remarkable plants. Yet while the legend cannot be proven, the location can. Modern genetic research has confirmed that Coffea arabica, the species responsible for most of the world's premium coffee, originated in the cloud forests of southwestern Ethiopia. Long before kingdoms competed for trade routes or merchants carried coffee across oceans, these forests were already home to wild coffee trees, growing quietly beneath towering canopies. Local communities almost certainly knew the plant well. Some historians believe they ate the sweet fruit or mixed crushed coffee cherries with animal fat to create an energy-rich food for long journeys, although written evidence remains limited. At this point in history, coffee was not yet a beverage. It was simply another wild plant among thousands growing across the Ethiopian highlands. No one could have imagined that these small red cherries would one day influence religion, politics, science, finance, and global trade. The transformation of coffee would not happen in Ethiopia. It would begin across a narrow stretch of water known as the Red Sea, where a new culture would discover not just the fruit itself, but the extraordinary drink hidden inside its seeds. There, coffee would take its first step toward changing the course of human civilization. No one knows exactly who carried coffee across the Red Sea. There was no famous explorer, no royal expedition, and no great fleet announcing the beginning of a new era. Sometime between the 14th and 15th centuries, merchants, pilgrims, or travelers transported coffee seeds from the forests of Ethiopia to the mountainous regions of Yemen. It was a journey of only a few hundred kilometers, yet it would permanently change the history of civilization. Unlike Ethiopia's dense forests, Yemen was a harsh land shaped by rocky mountains, dry valleys, and limited rainfall. Every fertile terrace carved into the hillsides represented years of labor, and every successful harvest depended on careful irrigation. Surprisingly, coffee adapted beautifully to this environment. The cool mountain air, volcanic soil, and high elevations produced beans with exceptional flavor. For the first time in history, coffee was no longer simply gathered from the wild. It was deliberately cultivated, carefully harvested, and gradually transformed into an agricultural crop. Growing coffee, however, was only the beginning. Farmers soon discovered that the true potential of the plant was hidden inside its seeds. After removing the sweet outer fruit, they dried the beans beneath the Arabian sun before roasting them over glowing charcoal. As the beans darkened, they released an aroma unlike anything people had experienced before. Curious experimenters crushed the roasted beans into powder, poured hot water over them, and created a rich, dark beverage that was both bitter and surprisingly refreshing. Coffee had finally become a drink. Its earliest and most devoted supporters were the Sufis, followers of a mystical tradition within Islam. Their nights were often filled with long hours of prayer, meditation, and spiritual reflection that sometimes lasted until dawn. Remaining awake demanded extraordinary discipline, and coffee became an unexpected companion. Unlike alcohol, which clouded the mind, coffee sharpened concentration and helped worshippers stay alert throughout the night. What began as a practical aid for religious devotion quickly became part of everyday life. As word spread, coffee moved beyond monasteries and into homes, markets, and caravan routes. Merchants loaded sacks of beans alongside spices, silk, incense, and precious metals, carrying them to cities throughout the Middle East. Pilgrims returning from Mecca introduced the drink to distant communities, while traders praised its remarkable ability to keep them awake during long journeys across deserts and mountains. Coffee was no longer a regional curiosity. It was becoming an international commodity. At the center of this expanding trade stood the port city of Mocha. Located on Yemen's western coast along the Red Sea, Mocha occupied one of the busiest maritime crossroads in the world. Ships from Egypt, Persia, India, East Africa, and later the Ottoman Empire anchored in its harbor, waiting to load one of the most valuable products of the age. For nearly 2 centuries, almost every coffee bean traded internationally passed through this single port. The city's name became so famous that even today, many people mistakenly believe Mocha describes a type of coffee rather than the place that introduced coffee to the global market. Yemen's rulers quickly realized the enormous value of what they possessed. Determined to protect their monopoly, they imposed strict controls on coffee exports. Foreign merchants were welcome to purchase roasted or dried beans, but fertile seeds capable of growing new trees were rarely allowed to leave the country. Some accounts suggest exported beans were intentionally treated to prevent germination, making it nearly impossible for rival nations to establish their own plantations. As long as Yemen controlled the living coffee tree, it controlled one of the world's most profitable trades. The strategy worked remarkably well. Wealth flowed into Yemen as demand continued to rise throughout the Islamic world. Every caravan leaving Mocha carried more than sacks of coffee. It carried influence, prosperity, and the promise of even greater trade. Yet something even more important than commerce was quietly taking shape. Everywhere coffee arrived, people gathered. They talked longer, exchanged ideas more freely, debated philosophy, shared poetry, discussed politics, and formed friendships with complete strangers. Coffee was creating an entirely new kind of social space, one that would soon spread across cities from Cairo to Damascus and eventually reshape societies far beyond the Middle East. Neither the merchants nor the rulers of Yemen realized it at the time, but coffee's greatest power was never its flavor or its value. It was its ability to bring people together. And once people began gathering to exchange ideas, those in power would soon begin to worry. The world's first coffee houses were about to appear, and with them came a question that would echo through history. Could a simple drink become powerful enough to threaten governments? By the early 16th century, coffee had spread across much of the Islamic world. Caravans carried it from Yemen to Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Constantinople, while pilgrims returning from Mecca introduced the drink to distant communities. Everywhere coffee arrived, something unexpected followed. People gathered not only to drink, but to talk, debate, and exchange ideas. Out of these gatherings emerged a new institution that would change urban life forever: the coffee house. Unlike palaces reserved for rulers or religious schools limited to scholars, coffee houses welcomed almost everyone. Merchants discussed trade routes with travelers. Poets recited new works beside musicians and craftsmen. Scholars debated philosophy, while ordinary citizens listened with curiosity. News from distant lands often reached these crowded rooms long before it appeared in official announcements. For the price of a single cup, anyone could join conversations that crossed social classes and professions. It did not take long for coffee houses to earn a remarkable reputation. Many people began calling them schools of the wise, not because formal lessons were taught there, but because knowledge flowed freely between strangers. In a world without newspapers, radio, or the internet, coffee houses became centers of information, where business deals were negotiated, scientific ideas were exchanged, and political opinions quietly spread from one table to another. That growing influence soon attracted unwanted attention. In 1511, Khair Beg, the governor of Mecca, became convinced that coffee houses were encouraging dangerous discussions. Large crowds gathered late into the night, beyond the direct control of local authorities, and rumors, criticism, and political debate spread rapidly through the city. To him, the greatest threat was not the drink itself, but the conversations it inspired. Khair Beg called together religious scholars and government officials to examine whether coffee should be prohibited. Some argued that its stimulating effects were unlike any other beverage. Others warned that coffee houses encouraged unrest and distracted people from religious duties. After days of debate, the governor reached his decision. Coffee was banned. Coffee houses were ordered to close. Merchants could no longer sell the drink openly, and public gatherings centered around coffee were declared illegal. Soldiers moved through the streets, shutting down popular meeting places, confiscating beans, and destroying supplies. For the first time in history, coffee had become a political issue rather than simply a beverage. Yet the ban produced the exact opposite of its intended effect. News spread quickly across the Islamic world. Scholars in Cairo questioned the ruling, merchants protested the disruption of trade, and religious authorities reviewed the arguments for themselves. Many concluded that coffee did not intoxicate the mind or violate Islamic law. Within a short time, the ban was overturned, and coffee houses reopened their doors. Instead of disappearing, coffee became even more popular. People returned in greater numbers than before, and new coffee houses appeared across major cities of the Ottoman Empire. The attempt to silence coffee had unintentionally transformed it into a symbol of intellectual freedom and open conversation. But while the Islamic world embraced its remarkable new drink, curious European merchants were watching from across the Mediterranean. They had tasted coffee, witnessed the bustling coffee houses of the East, and recognized its enormous commercial potential. Buying beans was no longer enough. Europe wanted something far more valuable. It wanted the coffee tree itself. By the beginning of the 17th century, coffee had crossed the Mediterranean and entered Europe. Venetian merchants were among the first to import the mysterious beans from the Ottoman Empire, selling them as an expensive luxury reserved for wealthy customers. To many Europeans, coffee was unlike anything they had ever tasted. It was dark, bitter, and completely different from the wine and beer that dominated everyday life. Some praised its ability to sharpen the mind, while others viewed it with deep suspicion. Because coffee arrived from the Islamic world, critics labeled it the devil's drink. Some religious leaders argued that a beverage associated with Muslim culture had no place in Christian Europe. The controversy eventually reached Pope Clement V. According to a famous tradition, the Pope decided to taste coffee before passing judgment. After taking a few sips, he reportedly enjoyed it so much that he refused to ban it, joking that it would be a shame to leave such an excellent drink to non-believers alone. Whether those exact words were ever spoken remains uncertain, but one fact is clear. The Church accepted coffee, removing the greatest obstacle to its spread across Europe. Demand exploded almost overnight. Coffee houses opened in Venice, London, Paris, Vienna, and Amsterdam, attracting merchants, scientists, writers, politicians, and philosophers. Unlike noisy taverns filled with alcohol, coffee houses encouraged clear thinking and long conversations. In England, they became known as penny universities because the price of a single cup allowed anyone to join discussions that might otherwise have been reserved for scholars and the wealthy. New ideas traveled from table to table. Businesses were launched, scientific discoveries were debated, and newspapers found eager readers. Coffee had become the drink of the Enlightenment. Yet Europe faced one frustrating problem. Nearly every bean still came from Yemen, and Yemeni traders carefully protected their monopoly by preventing fertile coffee seeds from leaving the country. European nations could buy roasted beans, but they could not grow their own coffee. As demand continued to rise, prices remained high, and governments realized that purchasing coffee was no longer enough. Whoever controlled the coffee tree itself would control one of the world's most profitable industries. The race to obtain living coffee plants quietly began. Among the first to succeed were the Dutch East India Company, one of the most powerful trading organizations in history. Somehow, despite Yemen's strict controls, Dutch merchants acquired fertile coffee seedlings and transported them across the Indian Ocean to their colony on the island of Java, in present-day Indonesia. There, the trees thrived in volcanic soil and a tropical climate, producing abundant harvests. For the first time, coffee was successfully cultivated outside Arabia, and Yemen's monopoly began to collapse. Europe had achieved what once seemed impossible, but the Dutch would not remain alone for long. France, Portugal, and Spain all wanted their own coffee plantations, and they were willing to take extraordinary risks to obtain them. The next chapter of coffee's history would not be driven by merchants buying beans. It would be shaped by smugglers, rival empires, and a single fragile coffee tree whose journey across the Atlantic would change the world forever. By the early 18th century, coffee had become one of Europe's most valuable commodities. Demand continued to grow, but one challenge remained. Although the Dutch had successfully established plantations in Java, every major European empire wanted its own independent supply. France, Portugal, and Spain understood that whoever controlled coffee production would gain enormous wealth. The battle was no longer about buying beans. It was about possessing the living tree. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam presented a young coffee plant to King Louis XIV of France as a diplomatic gift. The fragile seedling was placed inside the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris, where it received constant care and protection. To most visitors, it was simply an exotic plant. Few realized that this single tree represented the future of a global industry. Several years later, a young French naval officer named Gabriel Declus prepared to sail to the Caribbean island of Martinique. Before departing, he managed to obtain a seedling descended from the royal coffee tree. His mission seemed simple: transport the plant safely across the Atlantic. In reality, it became one of the most remarkable voyages in agricultural history. The crossing was filled with danger. Powerful storms battered the ship, violent winds threatened to destroy the precious cargo, and fresh drinking water became dangerously scarce. According to one of the most famous stories in coffee history, Declus chose to share part of his own daily water ration with the young coffee plant, believing that its survival was more important than his comfort. Historians still debate how much of the story is legend, but they agree on one crucial fact: the coffee tree survived. When the ship finally reached Martinique, the seedling adapted quickly to the island's fertile volcanic soil and tropical climate. Within a few years, it produced thousands of new trees. Those trees supplied millions of additional seedlings that spread throughout the Caribbean and eventually into Central and South America. From a single fragile plant, an entire continent's coffee industry was born. As coffee plantations expanded, European empires rushed to claim more land. Vast forests were cleared, plantations stretched across fertile valleys, and coffee exports increased year after year. For investors and colonial governments, coffee promised extraordinary profits, but cultivating coffee on such a massive scale required an enormous workforce. Harvesting could not be mechanized. Every ripe cherry still had to be picked by hand at exactly the right moment. To solve that problem, plantation owners turned to the system that already powered much of the Atlantic economy: slavery. Across West Africa, millions of men, women, and children were captured through wars and slave trading networks before being forced onto ships bound for the Americas. Those who survived the brutal Atlantic crossing were sold into lifelong labor on plantations producing sugar, cotton, tobacco, and increasingly, coffee. The drink that had once united scholars and merchants would now become deeply connected to one of the darkest chapters in human history. Coffee had escaped Arabia and conquered the world. But its greatest expansion came at a terrible human cost, and nowhere would that cost become more visible than in Brazil, a country that would soon transform coffee into the largest agricultural industry on earth. By the 19th century, Brazil had become the center of the global coffee industry. Its fertile land, tropical climate, and vast plantations allowed production to expand at an astonishing pace. Railroads were built to carry coffee from inland farms to busy Atlantic ports. Entire towns grew around the trade, and before long, Brazil was producing more coffee than the rest of the world combined. For decades, the country's economy depended heavily on a single crop. The industry continued to rely on enslaved labor until 1888, when Brazil officially abolished slavery, becoming the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. Freedom finally arrived, but it did not erase generations of injustice. Most formerly enslaved workers received neither land nor financial support, leaving many trapped in poverty, while plantation owners continued to profit from the booming coffee trade. As Brazil dominated global production, another revolution was taking place across Europe and North America. Factories replaced workshops, cities expanded rapidly, and millions of people began working long hours in mines, mills, and manufacturing plants. Coffee fit perfectly into this new industrial world. Unlike alcohol, it kept workers awake, alert, and productive. A morning cup quickly became part of everyday life, fueling factories, offices, and universities alike. Innovation soon changed not only how coffee was consumed, but also how it was prepared. In Italy, inventors developed machines capable of forcing hot water through finely ground coffee under high pressure, giving birth to espresso. The rich, concentrated drink perfectly matched the fast pace of modern cities. Soon afterward, Instant coffee made preparation even easier, allowing soldiers, travelers, and busy families to enjoy coffee almost anywhere, with nothing more than hot water. Following the Second World War, coffee consumption reached unprecedented levels. International brands expanded across continents, cafes became cultural landmarks, and coffee evolved from a simple beverage into a daily ritual shared by billions of people. Today, more than 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed around the world every single day, making it one of the most traded agricultural products on Earth. Yet coffee's journey was still far from over. While Brazil remained the world's largest producer, another country in Southeast Asia was quietly transforming itself into a global coffee powerhouse. Within just a few decades, Vietnam would rise from a relatively small producer to become the world's second-largest exporter, opening an entirely new chapter in the history of coffee. Coffee first arrived in Vietnam during the 19th century under French colonial rule. Missionaries and colonial administrators introduced coffee trees to the fertile highlands, believing the region offered ideal growing conditions. For decades, production remained relatively small, interrupted by wars and political instability. Everything changed after the economic reforms of Doi Moi in 1986. As Vietnam opened its economy to global markets, coffee production expanded at an extraordinary pace. New farms spread across the Central Highlands, modern infrastructure connected plantations to international ports, and within a single generation, Vietnam became the second-largest coffee producer in the world, surpassed only by Brazil. Unlike many producing countries that focused primarily on Arabica, Vietnam specialized in Robusta coffee. More resilient to heat, disease, and changing weather, Robusta produced higher yields and contained nearly twice as much caffeine as Arabica. Its bold flavor made it essential for espresso blends and instant coffee, supplying millions of cups enjoyed every day across Europe, Asia, and North America. Behind nearly every supermarket shelf and cafe menu, Vietnamese farmers had become an invisible but indispensable part of the global coffee industry. Yet as production reached record levels, coffee faced a challenge unlike any in its history. Not war, not empire, not competition, climate change. Coffee is an exceptionally sensitive crop. Small increases in temperature, unpredictable rainfall, prolonged droughts, and the spread of pests and diseases are already reducing harvests in many of the world's most important growing regions. Scientists warn that, without effective adaptation, a significant portion of today's land, suitable for growing high-quality Arabica coffee, could disappear before the end of this century. For millions of farming families, this is no longer a distant prediction. It is their daily reality. Around the world, farmers are adapting by planting shade trees, improving irrigation systems, and cultivating more resilient coffee varieties. Researchers continue developing plants capable of withstanding hotter climates, while preserving the flavors that coffee lovers expect. At the same time, consumers are becoming more aware of where their coffee comes from. Fair trade and sustainable farming initiatives are encouraging companies to support growers more responsibly, recognizing that the future of coffee depends on the people who cultivate it. Looking back, the journey of coffee is unlike that of almost any other plant. It began as a wild shrub, hidden in the forests of Ethiopia. It crossed the Red Sea to Yemen, where it became a drink of faith and community. It inspired the world's first coffee houses, challenged governments, crossed oceans through imperial ambition, fueled the Industrial Revolution, and ultimately connected nearly every nation through trade. Along the way, it also carried stories of exploration, scientific discovery, colonial expansion, and the suffering of millions whose labor built one of the world's largest industries. Today, more than 2 billion cups of coffee are consumed every single day. Most people drink it without thinking about the remarkable journey behind each sip. Yet every bean carries the legacy of ancient forests, daring voyages, bustling ports, crowded coffee houses, hard-working farmers, and generations of people whose lives shaped the history of this extraordinary drink. The next time you hold a warm cup of coffee, take a moment before the first sip. Inside that simple cup is more than flavor or caffeine. It is over 1,000 years of human history, a story of curiosity, ambition, sacrifice, innovation, and resilience that continues to unfold with every new harvest. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of coffee. In our next documentary, we'll uncover the remarkable story behind another plant that transformed civilizations, reshaped economies, and changed the course of human history. Until then, thank you for watching.